Hello, this is Roger Capello. I'm bringing you My Week at the Club, episode number 39. Hopefully this will go a little more smoothly than my last episode. I ran into some software glitches. If that happens again, I'll just pause the recording and reinitialize the chess program. I got some feedback on my last video, and people said that maybe a little longer would be good, but not terribly much longer. So I'll target for 25 or 30 minutes in this one and see how that works out. I have an interesting game this week that I played against Larry Gladding. But before I get into that, I want to give you the brief astronomer's corner here. And as you can see, it's going to be about Mars this week. As possibly you know, Mars has had a dust storm blowing quite strongly here for several months. And it's covered pretty much most of the planet. Now this Hubble Space Telescope image here that is over on the right is showing it as it's emerging from the dust storm, where you're starting to see some features. But the effect of it on the Mars rovers has been sort of difficult because at its deepest the opacity of the dust storm got so strong that it diminished the light at the surface by a factor of about 200, and that meant that the Opportunity rover had problems. So you might remember Opportunity. It had it's kind of a funny looking thing with 6 wheels and a flat top full of solar cells, and those solar cells need sunlight to power it, and it's been there. It's our longest lived rover. It's been there since 2004, I believe. Roving around on the surface and making useful observations. And after the dust storm, they don't know the condition it's in. Maybe it has dust on it or whatever, but it hasn't phoned home yet. And so they're hoping that they'll connect with it. The light levels are probably back to 15 or 20% of what they should be. And they're expecting that they have enough power now that they really should be able to see that the rover really should have enough power to communicate back with Earth. On the other hand, the Curiosity rover, which is a more modern one that landed back in 2012, I guess it was, doesn't have, and that's the one by Gale Crater. And has been taking the selfie pictures and so on, fabulous pictures from the surface of Mars. Doesn't have this problem because it has RTGs, radioisotope thermal generators, so nuclear power sources. It doesn't rely upon sunlight, and also they provide more power than the solar cells do, and that's why it's been able to keep on operating right through this dust storm. So that's the astronomy corner for this week, and let's get back to Earth instead of Mars. I played Larry Gladding this week, as I've mentioned before, second round of the John Stopa Memorial. And Larry, we got into an opening similar to some that we've played in the past, Benko Gambit. So Larry opened with d4, and the first several moves, that's an offer to a Benoni. He steps right into it. Now I'm offering a Benko Gambit. He accepts the Gambit pawn. White doesn't have to accept it, but it's most common to go ahead and take that pawn. Black ensures that the pawn is really lost by offering a second pawn, and then typically after that pawn is taken, they'd recapture on a6. Larry doesn't take that, however, and what he did play was f3, and that, to be honest, got me out of book already. I was a bit surprised and wasn't sure what to do. Now, this is not that uncommon of a position. I probably really should know it. So I sat there for quite a while, thought about it, and decided to proceed on, with fairly normal looking moves. So, fianchetto the dark squared bishop. The problem is I'm a little afraid of what's going to happen on the light squares. I saw that he would play e4 next. That was expected. And now if I went ahead and continued on fianchettoing the bishop, I'll just look at that line here briefly. That's not what I did. I was worried by this move of e5 attacking my knight. because it's in a very exposed position. If I went to h5 here, it could go lost after g4, for example, so I can't really afford to do that. I'd have to play it back to g8. And if I do that, it's a very cramped position. And I was, I felt that maybe white is overextended and that in theory I could do okay. But I really didn't have a desire to play this sort of position. And after all, I started out playing a Gambit. I don't want to be here on my back foot. So instead of playing the bishop to g7 and allowing him to do that, I instead played the pawn to d6, preventing the pawn advance to e5. Now, I was worried about doing that because of what could follow over here on the queen side. So he could very easily, for his next move, trade off the pawns. And if I take back with the bishop, say, he could come out with the queen check. And in my head, I was analyzing the continuation, queen d7, queen takes, knight takes. And even though this isn't horrible for black, I didn't like the idea of getting rid of the queens with me being a pawn down in this position. I wanted to keep the queens on the board so that I'd have some attacking chances. He's behind the development here. He's made some concessions. I mean, he's got this very strong pawn chain on the light squares, but of course that weakens him now on the dark squares behind the pawn chain. And that might be a way to attack the king, but it's going to be hard to do if I don't have my queen on the board. I didn't want to do that. Now, what I could have done in this position right here when he checked would have been to drop back my f knight to d7, and that would have kept everything well protected, and I could have continued on without allowing the queens to get traded off. But I didn't really consider that, so that's why I played the d6 move back when I did, and worried a little bit about what would happen afterward. So I needn't have worried, because he wanted to play. He had a different plan in mind, which is to develop the knight through a3 and then to c4. So that's certainly quite playable. I went to develop my bishop, and now he brought his other knight over, and there's really no way to stop this. I castled, and he comes to c3, and now he has a real stranglehold on this b5 square. And of course, it would be positionally be very bad for me to trade off pawns now and allow him to occupy this b5 square with one of his minor pieces. So I don't. As long as I keep my pawn on a6, I'm controlling that square. Now he can trade off the pawns, but at least that develops one of my pieces and gives me an edge in what's going on the queen side, basically, and the little more say in determining what's happening over there. So in this position, I was a bit worried, and I felt that I had to do something. I think he's in good shape on the queen side with this formation of the knights supporting this square, and the bishop's going to come out and so on. And I have to do something, and I decided the principled response here would be to strike out in the center. So that's what I did. I played e6, and to try to tear open the pawn center, particularly while his king is still stuck on e1. He's behind in development, and if I could, I'd like to open some lines before his king gets out of the center. He responded to this with bishop to g5. Turns out that's a novelty. That's where our game gets out of the databases. So I'll go back half a move here. And the principal moves are for the bishop to come to e2 or to c4. That was 19 out of 20 of the people did that. In the 20th game, I think white traded off the e and d pawns. But nobody pinned this bishop, or I pinned the knight rather with the bishop. But it's not a bad move. At least Stockfish doesn't think so. And if I analyze it with Stockfish here up in the corner, white still has an advantage of a fraction of a pawn. It wants me to play h6, and that's exactly what I did, thinking that he might actually trade off, and that that would probably be best for him. He didn't do that. Instead, he retreated the bishop, and then, which allowed me to drive it further back. And now my idea is to try to get some sort of, to open up the center and check with my rook along the e-file if I can. I expected him to either retreat the bishop to g3 or to f2. G3 because it puts, well, that was my main expectation, because that puts a lot of pressure on the d-pawn, or f2 because it solidifies his king's position, and it's a very secure square for the bishop to go to. But he surprised me. He thought for a little while and then decided to sacrifice the bishop. And I thought for a while and decided I should accept it, and the reasons will become clear why I decided to accept it. So I went ahead and took the bishop, and now he goes ahead and continues with pawn takes pawn check. Now he started out with one pawn just from it being a gambit. He took a second pawn there on e6, and now he's taken a third pawn. So it's 3 pawns for the piece at this point. If I try to take the pawn back with my rook, then his bishop will come out and to c4 and pin along this light square diagonal and win the exchange back. Didn't want to do that, so I played the king to the corner. And so this gives him a full 3 pawns of advantage at this point. But my thinking is that this pawn on f7 is really not a threat. I don't currently have it surrounded, but I could soon have it surrounded, and I could probably win it back fairly easily. And then he only has 2 pawns, and this weak pawn over here that maybe he was figuring didn't count as a full pawn for me. If I figured, where's his king going to go? He doesn't have a place on the queen side that's safe, and so the king side is probably where it's going to end up. And in that case, if I push the pawn to h3, then I'll be able to disrupt the pawn's shelter in front of his king, and so that pawn will become very valuable, my h-pawn. So that was my thinking. That's why I accepted the sacrifice. So he played out the queen. I expected the bishop to protect the pawn, but the queen works as well. And I, at this point, decided to exchange my a pawn for his b pawn, primarily so that I could open up my rook. I wanted to get the rook into the game. Also, there were some interesting tactical lines having to do with that pawn advancing. But I don't have time to go into that now because I'm trying to keep it under half an hour. Okay, so after he took the pawn there, now what I'm trying to do is to get enough attacks on this pawn to win it, and so the idea is to start out with getting my, I need to keep this, need to do several things at once. I want to win this f-pawn, but at the same time I want to keep defending the d-pawn, because he has one attack on it now with his knight. He is threatening to play rook to d1 or maybe castling long. Either way, having a second attack on this pawn. So I'm going to have to be ready to do something like playing this rook to a6, is my thought at the time, to defend that pawn a second time. And so I didn't, I couldn't afford to block my queen's defense of it with the knight going to d7 or something like that. I have to keep it under observation. I also didn't want to have, with my queen on d8, if he puts his rook on d1 here, then along the d file, I'm really worried that he will, that pin could be fatal, that pin of the d-pawn. So that's why I unpinned the queen, and I'm getting ready to win this pawn over on f7. So that's why he went ahead and played bishop to c4. Let me scroll this up a bit. Okay. So now not only does he have 2 defenses on this pawn, but he's defending it first with a minor piece, so I need to attack it with a minor piece. And my bishop can no longer go to e6 because he has that square under control twice. So instead I've got to use some other piece. And in looking at this position, I decided that the best way to proceed is to get my knight developed to where it could attack both his queen and bishop at the same time, and thus win the bishop, take the bishop off. So that's what I did. I played knight c6. And then this prevents the idea of, castling and winning this pawn, because my knight actually will chase away the queen, and then I'll be winning, taking the bishop on the next move. So, what did he do? Well, he played his queen back to d1, which surprised me a little bit. It's an undeveloping move. It is, it makes sense because he really didn't have a way to keep my knight from coming to a5 to attack him, so it's going to happen sooner or later. And with this move, he now is attacking this pawn with the knight and the queen. So I have to do something to shore up that pawn. And now I can no longer play my a rook up to a6 to defend it laterally from the side. But what I can do is play my other rook over to the d file. And that took me a little while to realize, because I was thinking that I wanted to keep my rook on f8 to blockade his pawn, to keep it from having a chance of queening. But then I realized that my bishop really is a very strong piece for protecting that queening square, and I don't really need the rook physically blockading the pawn, and that it would be more valuable on the d file here, threatening the queen through the pawn. It's actually threatening a pawn advance here at some point, and not so. It's not only a defensive move, but it's actually an offensive move. So I liked it once I saw that. He went and castled at this point, and that gave me time to play knight e5 to attack his light squared bishop. And I expected him now to actually to play the bishop to d5, attacking my rook. And then I don't really want to block with my bishop, even though it's defended, because if he plays bishop takes bishop, I have to take back. And now he could play knight takes pawn. I'm not sure that this is good, because this knight is, in fact, it probably isn't good. It's attacked along, it's pinned along the d file, and it would be easier to get a second attack. Although he could defend it with a knight and use a pawn to anchor the knight. Let's just cheat and see what Stockfish says. Now I'm right in the first place. It's a bad idea going ahead and taking that pawn. So yeah, so he really couldn't take the pawn, but I didn't really want to see that happen. So I probably, if he had played the bishop here, I probably would have played my rook over to b8, to b8, just to get it off of the light squares. Notice that in this position, turn that off, I'm not, although I see Stockfish is calling for it, I didn't particularly want to play knight takes d5, because with the knight taking back, he'll win a tempo on my queen and get a very strong post for his knight on d5, this line. And now my queen has to move, and he's got some very strong looking knights. So even though Stockfish is happy with this, apparently, because I just go ahead and take the f pawn. Okay, that makes sense. It wasn't a situation I wanted to go into. So anyway, we didn't go into that line because after I played knight to c6, and he played his queen back, and I played my rook over, and he castled. Sorry for going back so far. And I attacked the bishop. Then he went back to e2. Okay, so I didn't expect that. It's a kind of a quiet post for the bishop there on e2. How are we doing for time? 20 minutes, so we have about 10 minutes to finish up the game. It was a short game, so hopefully we'll be able to finish this. Of course, this allowed me, now that the bishop is no longer, well, I mean, even if he had stepped back to b3, now I have the knight attacking the pawn as well as the queen, and either way I would have been able to take the pawn, which I did. Once I did that, I feel a lot better just looking at my position. I have lots of squares under control. My pieces are becoming coordinated. They were a little uncoordinated, and I actually have a lead in development. I have a lot more open lines than he has. So if you look at the evaluation here, yeah, it's about -2. So black is actually in pretty good shape at this point. Larry played queen to e1 then, threatening to take my pawn on h4, and also maybe hinting that he wants to come over and attack on the king side. Okay, so I figured this was a good time to go ahead and push it, which was on my menu for for quite a while now. I've wanted to do that, but I didn't think it felt like it was too slow. Now, actually, Stockfish several times over the last 4 or 5 moves wanted to get this h3 move in, so it didn't feel maybe that it was too slow, because it's a fairly I don't really lose a tempo because yeah, I do lose 1 tempo. It takes me 2 moves, 1, 2. Even if he leaves the pawn there, it takes me 2 moves to capture the pawn, and then he has to move the rook, so that's a tempo. So I lose a net of 1 tempo in the process. But if he does what he did, I don't lose any tempos at all if he plays g3. And the beauty of that, of course, is that now this g2 square is very weak, and at some point a queen could plop down there, or a bishop or something. It's also just restricting the king's mobility. It sets up some checkmating possibilities. Okay, so in this position, I was able finally to play d5, which is the other move I wanted to play, because that now undid the pawn weakness, that Benoni sort of pawn structure that I've had since the 3rd or 4th move. And the best he can do is trade things off at this point. I'm threatening to win his e-pawn, and oddly he sort of ignores my threats, and instead just played a4, supporting this knight, and to build a kind of a strong queenside formation, which, if the game went 30 more moves, then this is a good way to set up your pawns on the queen side, with the pawns on b3 and a4, and the knight here sheltering, and the rook back behind. And eventually, after pieces get traded off, then this a-pawn could win the game. But the problem is the game doesn't go that far because of this mobility of the black pawns in the center. So instead of winning the e-pawn here, which would open up the file for his rook and make his bishop suddenly very active and so on, I wanted to keep all of his counterplay to a minimum. So what I did was actually to press the pawn forward and to attack the knight. And now the knight really has nowhere to go. It could go back to a2 or back to b1, which is what I expected. Instead, he came forward, but that just loses a pawn. I mean, he could have, back in this position, he could have played knight takes pawn and gone into the same variation and gotten rid of that pesky pawn. Now, I'm sorry, back in this position, before he moved his a-pawn, he could have taken the pawn. Instead, he moved the a-pawn. It gave me a chance to go forward and now get that d-pawn aggressively running forward into his position. And now, when he goes to d5, I can simply win it with my rook. And if he attacks my rook with the bishop, I'm just going to play it over to e-file. And he basically did something like that, played the bishop to d3, threatening maybe on a good day to play the bishop to e4 and skewer these 2 rooks. But that ain't going to happen, because my next move is rook e5. And now, with the tempo here, I'm grabbing the e-file, and white's position rather is really dead. The evaluation has to be -6 or 7, I imagine. It's -5 and climbing rapidly, so right. So -6. Yep. It really doesn't like it. I expected queen to d2, which is what Stockfish is recommending. He actually played to f2, where I think it's a little cramped. And that allowed me to continue on with bishop to b7, now completing my development here, being able to get my other rook into the game, and also grabbing this really strong diagonal, keeping his bishop off of e4, but also threatening um, the squares around his king. Okay, he played e4, which is sort of a form of, or f4 rather, which is a form of hara-kiri at this point. And I moved my rook forward. So, this is really tough because now this light square diagonal is open all the way past his king. I mean, the bishop could land on g2, or the queen could find its way in there, and I'm winning another tempo attacking the bishop. This is, pretty tough. Now, what he was planning on was this move, which I had foreseen and was not worried about. I think originally because I was going to play my other rook to, I was thinking about some sort of move like this, and so that if he took, I could take back, and now he can't play rook to e1 because my queen and rook could just win it. After I got into this position right here, after he played the rook over, I looked at it for a little while and saw this very tasty move of queen to d7, and I played it basically because I misanalyzed the position. I goofed up my tactics, and I'll show you in a second what it is that I missed. Fortunately, though, black's position is so strong that this is, part of the reason I did this is to get my queen over onto the light square so it could help the bishop attack. And that was correct. There's a detail in the tactics I missed, though, because what happened was after rook takes, pawn takes, I figured that he couldn't play queen takes pawn because my bishop here would come here. Oops, didn't mean to do that. My bishop would come to. Okay, here I'll just play it. If white took the pawn, I was seeing in my head that the bishop had come here and pinned the queen. Not saying, of course, that the knight could just trade off the bishop. However, once I made this move, and before he took my rook, I realized that this knight, that sequence wouldn't work because the knight would exchange off the bishop. But I also realized that if he did make that move, that I had rook to e8, and so in this position, if he grabs a pawn with the queen, let's see, did I already look at that? Yeah. Then I could just play rook to e8, and this is extremely bad for white rather. So he doesn't take it. Instead, he played to c2, and after he went to c2, I got onto the light square diagonal, which is a extremely hard threat to meet. The only thing he can do that really will prevent mate here, or like he could play king to f1, but I can come in, check, and win the rook if nothing else. His minimum loss of material is to go ahead and block with the bishop here, and I can simply take it, and his queen takes, and I take his queen, and now I'm 2 pieces up in a trivially one endgame. It's still with all kinds of pluses here, including a pawn on e3, passed pawn on e3. So that would be the best thing for him to do. I think he just kind of got tired of it and played knight c7, hoping that I would get bluffed or whatever, but I didn't. I just went ahead and played queen h1 mate. So that was the end of the game, and it was a fun one for me. It was interesting. Just skip back, go through very quickly. A Benko Gambit with that f3 idea, and I was able to, after he build up that strong queenside formation, I was able to tear apart the center pawns, and after that, jumping a little too far here, he sacrificed, and the sacrifice turned out in the long run not to be sound. and I was able to develop quickly enough. It was the fact that my pieces were really poised to spring into action that was really his undoing, and allowed me to quickly mobilize and take over the center. And now there's just really nothing to be done in this position. So that's it. It's 30 minutes, almost exactly, so it's time to sign off. This has been Roger Capello. I hope you enjoyed my week at the club. So long.